December 21, 1944. 0437 hours. A frozen crossroads east of Trois-Ponts, Belgium. Snow drifted in broken sheets across the open fields, carried by wind that hissed through the shattered windows of a two-story stone farmhouse. The building had served as an improvised medical station for the 30th Infantry Division until a German artillery strike landed across the road. The blast tore down the south wall, crushed the front entrance and hurled burning timber across the courtyard. Inside, more than 24 wounded men lay on stretchers, some conscious, others silent in morphine sleep. A medic still held a lantern over a soldier's leg stump, the flame trembling as another shell crackled in the distance. Sergeant Elias Bram stood at the corner of the ruins, frost gathering on his eyebrows. He watched the smoke curl from the collapsed doorframe and listened to the muffled shouting inside. Snowflakes touched the heat rising from the roof, melting instantly. The air smelled of splintered pine, blood, and the chemical sting of powder from the initial strike. Men needed evacuation. Procedures demanded ambulances. The ambulances were half a mile away behind a shattered bridge, unable to advance through rubble or the machine gun fire that covered the road. Another shell burst far to the north. The farmhouse trembled. Elias calculated the odds. He judged the distance between the courtyard wall and the barn. He considered the tools scattered in the yard, the broken wagon tongue, and the mule harness frozen stiff beside a collapsed trough. He remembered the grain elevator back home in Oklahoma, where his uncle lifted 100-pound sacks through narrow shafts using rope, pulleys and a simple crank. The memory settled in his mind like a weight. He knew the chimney in the farmhouse ran straight through the structure. He knew the interior shaft was wide enough for a stretcher if angled correctly. A lieutenant rushed toward the entryway, waving medics to try the back door. The back door no longer existed, crushed beneath 2 tons of stone. The lieutenant repeated regulations about structural collapse. He repeated guidelines for casualty extraction. Elias listened without responding. He stared at the jagged chimney that rose above the snowfall like a column of blackened brick. Minutes passed without progress. Inside, a corporal cried out as sparks fell onto bandages near his chest. 2 medics stamped snow into the smoldering hay that had blown through the broken entrance. A runner returned from division headquarters with a message. No engineers were available for immediate assistance. No bulldozer could reach the site without drawing fire. The order was to hold the wounded in place until artillery could silence the German positions. Elias stepped away from the courtyard and crossed to the barn. He moved with the certainty of a man who had made decisions like this before, decisions that went against instructions but kept men breathing. Inside the barn he found a coil of thick rope used for hauling livestock. He tested it with a sharp pull. The fibers held. He found a half-functioning pulley mounted to a rafter, snapped from a wagon during the recent shelling. He removed it with a pry bar, his breath fogging in the cold. He dragged the rope and pulley into the courtyard. The medics looked at him as he set the equipment down near the chimney base. They heard him mutter measurements. They heard the quick evaluation of weight distribution, friction burn points, and hoist angle. The lieutenant demanded to know what he intended. Elias answered without hesitation. He intended to pull the wounded straight up through the chimney. The lieutenant declared the idea impossible. The shaft was narrow. The structure was compromised. The fire risk was too high. Elias continued setting the pulley brace against the chimney stones, securing it with iron nails from the wagon wreckage. Inside the farmhouse, flames had reached the rafters above the main treatment room. Smoke curled into the loft. A medic shouted that the air was thinning. Another man shouted that the roof supports were cracking. Elias entered through a side gap, stepping over collapsed beams. He inspected the chimney interior. The soot-coated shaft stretched nearly 20 feet upward. He measured the width with his hands. It would be tight but possible. He ordered the medics to wrap the stretchers with spare blankets to prevent friction burns. The lieutenant ordered him to stop. Command had not approved the rig. The structure was not inspected. Any failure would crush a man in stone or drop him onto the debris below. Elias ignored the warnings. He had lifted grain sacks heavier than some of the wounded. He had maneuvered awkward loads through tighter shafts than this when storms had threatened to drown the mill back home. The key was to maintain constant tension, keep the rope fed evenly, and trust the pulley to do most of the lifting. Outside, machine gun fire raked the treeline. A German patrol tested the American perimeter. A medic ducked as rounds hit the courtyard wall. The situation was deteriorating. Every minute lost meant another man suffocating or burning. Elias secured the crank handle onto the pulley and called for the first casualty. A private with shrapnel in his thigh was chosen. The medics moved him slowly to the chimney base. Snowflakes continued drifting through the collapsed roof. The flames had not yet reached the shaft. Elias tied the stretcher to the hoist lines using double hitches. He checked the counterweight. He had filled 2 sandbags from the courtyard and attached them opposite the rope. The weight needed to be enough to offset the stretcher but not enough to pull it uncontrolled. He tested the crank once. The pulley turned with a groan. He tested again. The rope slid cleanly over the iron wheel. Snow melted on his gloves as he tightened his grip. He signaled the medics to guide the stretcher into the shaft. They tilted it upward. The private groaned. Elias began turning the crank, each rotation measured, steady, relentless. The stretcher rose inch by inch. Soot drifted down. A medic climbed the interior rubble to follow the ascent, guiding the stretcher away from snags. After 4 minutes the private emerged through the upper chimney opening. An infantryman waiting on the roof platform pulled him onto solid ground and carried him to the rear. The lieutenant stared in disbelief. The impossible had become a functioning evacuation line. Elias reset the rope and called for the next casualty. The 19th casualty rose through the chimney under a shower of sparks. The medic guiding the stretcher wiped burning soot from his coat sleeve as he climbed. Elias kept his eyes fixed on the rope. The fibers tightened, flexed, then settled. The stretcher reached the top with difficulty. The infantryman on the roof leaned dangerously close to the edge, pulling the wounded man across the sloped debris toward the stable's collapsed rafters. Inside the farmhouse, fire filled the ceiling space. Wooden beams twisted as they burned. The air shimmered with heat. A medic shouted that the smoke was becoming lethal. Another coughed until blood spotted the cloth across his mouth. Elias motioned for them to rotate out briefly for fresh air, but the flames pushed too fast for anyone to rest for long. The 20th man was prepared. He had abdominal wounds and had lost too much blood already. 2 medics lifted him toward the chimney, shielding his face as burning fragments drifted downward. Elias tied the hoist lines with quick precision. He added another half sandbag to the counterweight, then began turning the crank. The pulley spun faster. The stretcher rose quicker than before, scraping brick as it went. The medic inside moved alongside it, guiding it through falling embers. The 20th soldier emerged through the top, barely conscious. Snow fell across his face, melting as it touched his fevered skin. He was pulled clear. Elias reset the hoist again. The 20th, 21st, and 22nd casualties followed in rapid succession. Each lift became more dangerous. The flames below had reached the chimney base, creating a funnel of rising heat. Elias shielded his face with his shoulder as he tied knots. The rope had begun to darken from charring in some sections. He cut away blackened fibers with his knife, then spliced a fresh length from the remaining coil. Shells detonated again, closer than before. The second barrage shook dust loose from the chimney crown. Snow mixed with falling ash. Through the smoke, German machine gun fire continued to rake the nearby hedgerow. The courtyard floor convulsed with impacts. Splinters of brick burst around the pulley mount. A medic stumbled while dragging another wounded man forward. Elias grabbed the stretcher, steadied it, and tied the lines. He worked without pause. The lieutenant stood beside him now, no longer objecting. He simply stared at the burning structure and whispered that command had given no alternative plan. Elias replied that plans did not matter. Only time mattered. He cranked again. The 23rd man rose. Elias felt the rope tense unevenly. He adjusted his grip, altering the angle to compensate for heat warping the pulley's groove. Sweat ran through soot on his cheeks. His arms throbbed. The stretcher reached the top. Snowflakes hissed as they fell through the firelight. As the 24th soldier was lifted, the chimney base cracked. A deep rumble echoed through the ruins. Medics froze. Elias barked at them to keep moving. The crack was structural, but the upper chimney still held. Fire roared below, sending a column of heat up the shaft. It blurred the edges of the room like a mirage. The 25th casualty surfaced. Elias stepped back, coughing hard. His throat burned. His gloves had blistered on the inside. He adjusted them and moved toward the next wounded soldier. A corporal with burns along his back was carried forward. The flames reflected across his bandages. Elias tied the lines quickly. The rope sizzled as hot air rose. He turned the crank faster than before. The stretcher jerked upward. The medic inside climbed fast to keep pace, his coat smoking along the edges. At the top, the infantryman seized the stretcher and pulled it away from the opening. Elias's arms felt heavy. His breath came in harsh gasps. Yet he signaled for the 27th casualty. Outside the wind shifted. Smoke blew sideways across the courtyard, revealing the German treeline more clearly. Muzzle flashes blinked through the branches. Rounds struck the courtyard stones. One ricocheted off the chimney itself, sending a shard of brick past Elias's head. He ducked briefly, then returned to the crank. The 27th casualty rose and vanished through the chimney. Elias reset the lines. The 28th man had a fractured pelvis. Medics moved him slowly, wincing at each step. Fire licked at the floorboards near the chimney base. The flames gave off a crackling roar. Elias secured the stretcher, tested the rope tension and began cranking. His hands slipped on soot. He tightened his grip and continued. Halfway up, the stretcher snagged on a broken corner of brick. The medic inside climbed into the shaft itself, bracing with his knees against the burning wall. He freed the stretcher with a hard push. Sparks showered around him. Elias pulled harder. The stretcher rose. Snow fell through the smoke like white ash. The 28th casualty reached safety. A sudden crash shook the farmhouse. The entire eastern roof dropped into the lower chamber, scattering burning debris across the floor. Flames surged along the walls. The medics staggered back, shielding their faces from the heat. The lieutenant shouted that they had minutes, not hours. Elias moved toward the remaining wounded. More than a dozen still waited. Smoke rolled through the shattered windows, glowing orange from within. The fire had become a living force, clawing upward toward the chimney. He reached for the 29th casualty. This soldier was semi-conscious, his breathing shallow. Elias tied the lines carefully. He pulled the counterweight forward. The rope trembled. The heat rising through the shaft made his eyes water. He cranked anyway. Each turn felt heavier than the last. The stretcher rose into the smoke. The medic below climbed after it, coughing violently. His coat smoldered at the edges. He slapped out small flames with his bare hand. Elias continued cranking. The soldier emerged at the top. The infantryman hauled him clear. Elias stumbled backward, breath ragged. A medic tried to offer him water. He waved it away. He would drink later. He had work left. He signaled for the 30th casualty. Outside, the sky brightened toward dawn. The faint blue light touched the snow, contrasting with the orange glow from the burning farmhouse. The battlefield looked split between night and morning. German machine gun fire continued, but less frequently now. Smoke obscured their line of sight. Elias tied the lines to the 30th stretcher. The medic beside him trembled from exhaustion. Flames touched the lower chimney stones, making the brick glow faintly. Elias placed both hands on the crank and began turning again. The stretcher rose through the shaft. The rope strained. The pulley groaned louder than before. The medic below climbed quickly despite the fire licking at his boots. The stretcher emerged at the chimney top. Elias sagged slightly but remained standing. He wiped soot from his eyes and motioned for the next man. He had passed the halfway point. More than 30 men still waited in a burning ruin that no longer resembled a structure. He refused to stop. Flames climbed the interior walls, giving off a roaring pulse that shook the air. The chimney glowed faintly near its base. Elias stepped closer, examining the rope and pulley through the haze. Smoke burned his eyes. His gloves were scorched along the fingertips. The medics waited with the next casualty, a man with both legs splinted and wrapped in makeshift bandages already stained dark from blood loss. Elias tied the hoist lines and practiced motions. He lifted the counterweight and adjusted its angle. The rope hissed as heated air rose past it. He turned the crank. The stretcher lifted slowly through the vertical shaft. Embers clung briefly to the blanket before drifting off. The medic climbing inside scraped his shoulder against a burning beam but pushed through. After several tense moments, the soldier reached the top and was hauled onto the slanted stable roof. The 32nd casualty followed. The fire intensified below. Flames had grown tall enough to wrap around the chimney base, creating a column of orange that surged upward with every gust of wind. Elias timed his movements between the worst bursts of flame, tying knots with speed honed from years in his uncle's mill. He turned the crank again. The pulley squealed but rotated. Outside, dawn revealed the battlefield more clearly. Snow-covered fields stretched toward the treeline where German forces continued firing sporadic bursts. Machine gun rounds hit the courtyard stones. Shards of brick scattered near Elias's boots. He did not flinch. The stretcher rose. The infantryman on the roof dragged the casualty away from the opening, breath forming clouds in the cold air. The 33rd man lay close to delirium. Burns covered his arms and chest. Medics whispered that he had minutes. Elias moved quickly. He tied the lines, checking each loop with a single firm pull. The rope looked dangerously worn now. Several strands had blackened from heat. He cut away another section and spliced in fresh fiber from the remaining coil. The splice held. He cranked again. The stretcher rose into choking smoke. The medic inside climbed with difficulty, struggling to see through the haze. Flames burst through the floor beneath him. He kicked aside burning debris and forced himself higher. The stretcher emerged moments before the medic collapsed beside it on the chimney's upper edge. Infantrymen pulled both men clear. The lieutenant rushed toward Elias, shouting that the building was about to collapse entirely. He gestured to the sagging roofline and the widening cracks along the walls. Elias acknowledged him with a curt nod. The structure would fall. That was certain. But it had not fallen yet, and wounded soldiers still lay inside. He moved to the 34th casualty. This man suffered from a severe concussion. He could not open his eyes. 2 medics carried him toward the base of the chimney, shielding him from falling embers. Elias secured the stretcher. He braced the counterweight. He began turning the crank. His arms felt heavy, almost numb. The crank resisted every rotation. The pulley groaned under the strain. The stretcher climbed slowly but steadily. As it neared the top, another explosion thundered across the field. Snow and earth blasted into the air. The shockwave rocked the chimney. Elias held the crank steady, refusing to let the rope slacken. The stretcher reached the roof. The infantryman pulled it clear. Elias stepped back, coughing hard. The fire roared louder. Flames had reached the second floor completely. The interior staircase disintegrated in a shower of sparks. Medics covered their faces. Heat radiated through their coats. Elias signaled for the next casualty. The 35th soldier had deep shrapnel wounds across his torso. He grimaced as medics lifted him. The firelight reflected across his pale skin. Elias tied the lines and set the pulley in motion. The rope rubbed against a glowing red stone near the base. Smoke curled around it. Elias angled the rope and kept turning. Halfway up, the stretcher jerked violently. The medic inside shouted that the chimney had narrowed due to heat warping the bricks. Elias braced both feet and pulled harder. The rope strained. The stretcher scraped upward inch by inch. Finally, with one massive turn, the stretcher cleared the pinch point and rose into cooler air. The infantryman grabbed it at the top and dragged it out. Elias swayed on his feet. A medic grabbed his arm. He shook him off and moved to the next casualty. The 36th soldier had a crushed collarbone and severe leg wounds. Medics placed him inside the hoist cradle. Flames burst through the west wall, sending a jet of heat across the chimney base. Elias shielded his face with his shoulder and continued tying the knots. He ignored the warning crack of timber behind him. He placed both hands on the crank and pulled. The stretcher rose through rising fire. The medic inside climbed fast, his coat starting to smoke. He slapped out burning edges with frantic motions. Elias turned the crank faster. Smoke burned his lungs. His vision blurred. The stretcher emerged at the top. He reset the lines. He turned to the remaining wounded. Only a handful were left. The 37th casualty was carried forward by 2 medics coughing uncontrollably. The flames now formed a rolling wave across the interior floor. Elias tied the stretcher with trembling hands. The rope hissed in the heat. He began cranking again. The pulley turned with difficulty. He adjusted his stance and applied more force. The stretcher rose slowly. Burning debris collapsed behind him, crashing into the chimney base just after the stretcher cleared the opening. Elias kept cranking. His muscles screamed. His hands felt raw even through the gloves. The stretcher reached the top. The medics below staggered. Heat poured upward like a furnace. The chimney stones glowed orange. The room beneath them was no longer a room. It was a pit of fire. Elias looked at the 38th casualty. A young infantryman with a broken spine lay motionless on his stretcher. His breath came in shallow draws. The medics dragged him forward. Elias tied the lines. His fingers struggled with the knots. He tightened them. He turned the crank. The stretcher rose through a vortex of burning air. Embers spiraled upward. The medic inside pressed himself against the burning wall, guiding the stretcher despite the heat blistering his coat. Elias kept turning, each pull slower than the last. The stretcher emerged through the chimney. The infantryman on the roof pulled him clear but shouted that the structure was shaking violently. Elias saw cracks racing up the chimney's outer stones. He turned toward the next wounded man without hesitation. The building was about to collapse around him. The 39th casualty was a corporal with severe leg fractures and smoke inhalation. He could barely speak. His eyelids fluttered with each breath. Medics hurried him toward Elias while flames raged above their heads. Burning beams fell like collapsing bridges, each impact sending a roar through the ruined farmhouse. The chimney base glowed with deep orange light. Soot swirled around them in violent spirals. Elias tied the hoist lines slowly at first, then corrected himself and worked faster. His hands trembled. He tightened each knot by feel alone. The rope fibers were warm, almost hot, even before the lift began. The counterweight sagged under melting snow. Elias adjusted it to stop it from slipping. The rope sagged slightly, and a thin line of smoke rose from the heated fibers. He turned the crank. The pulley screamed. The stretcher lifted through the shaft. The medic assigned to guide the ascent climbed alongside it. His coat sleeves smoldered. He slapped the flames out while keeping his grip steady. The stretcher scraped against the narrowing walls. Elias continued cranking, head lowered against falling sparks. The stretcher rose through waves of scorching air. When it reached the top, the infantryman dragged it clear, shouting through the smoke that the chimney was shaking so violently it might split open. Elias ignored him. He moved to the 40th casualty. This man was unconscious, bandaged tightly across the chest and abdomen. His pulse was faint but steady. A medic knelt beside him, shielding him from drifting embers. Elias crouched low and tied the stretcher lines with careful precision. His gloves left black smudges across the canvas. The rope, frayed in sections, looked near its limit. Elias cut away the most damaged portion and made one final splice. He tested the tension. It held but weakly. The building groaned like a wounded animal. Flames roared. Through the loft. The ceiling above the chimney cracked in several places. The lieutenant shouted that the entire structure had less than 2 minutes before total collapse. Elias placed both hands on the crank. He began lifting the final wounded man. The rope tightened. The pulley groaned. Embers burst from the chimney entrance as heated air rushed upward. The medic guiding the stretcher climbed quickly, coughing violently as smoke swallowed him. Elias turned the crank faster, ignoring the stabbing pain in his arms and the rawness tearing through his chest with each breath. The stretcher rose inch by inch. The flames chased it upward, licking the shaft walls. Elias turned the crank again. The chimney vibrated under the strain. Another timber collapsed behind him, sending a plume of fire surging forward. Medics shielded their faces with their arms. Halfway up, the stretcher jerked to a stop. The shaft had narrowed again from heat warping the bricks. The medic shouted that it was wedged. Elias braced himself and pulled harder. The rope resisted, trembling. The medic inside pushed the stretcher upward with his shoulder, gasping for breath. Elias dug his boots into the scorched floor and pulled with every remaining ounce of strength. The rope strained. Fibers snapped one by one. But the stretcher moved, slowly at first, then with a final lurch that freed it from the narrowing. Elias turned the crank until his vision blurred. Firelight danced across his soot-covered face. His legs shook. His arms felt like dead weight. But the stretcher rose through the smoke. And then it cleared the chimney. The infantryman on the roof grabbed it, pulling the unconscious soldier onto the stable's collapsed rafters. Snow fell across the man's bandages, cooling the burned fabric. The medic inside the chimney collapsed near the top. Other infantrymen pulled him out before he slid back into the fire. Elias staggered back from the crank, coughing hard enough to nearly collapse. A medic tried to support him. He pushed the hand away and walked forward on his own feet, refusing to fall inside the burning ruin. At that moment the chimney shook violently. Cracks shot up its length like lightning. The heat inside had reached the breaking point. Elias took 3 steps back. The medics shouted for everyone to move. The chimney collapsed in on itself. Bricks fell inward, striking the floor where Elias had stood seconds earlier. The entire loft dropped into the blaze. Flames shot upward like a geyser. A roar filled the courtyard as the farmhouse finally gave way, collapsing into a mound of burning timber and stone. The hoist was gone. The rope burned in seconds. The pulley melted and fell among the wreckage. But 40 wounded men had already been pulled from the ruin. Snow drifted across the courtyard. The fire raged behind Elias, sending sparks into the brightening sky. Medics moved the wounded toward the rear. Infantrymen guided them across the collapsed stable roof to the safer side of the farmhouse, shielding them from stray rounds fired from the treeline. The lieutenant approached Elias, shock visible through soot streaks on his face. He looked at the ruins, then at the men carried to safety. He did not speak of the ban. No one did. Elias stood silently beside the smoking collapse, breath steaming in the cold air. He wiped soot from his eyes and adjusted his scarf. His hands shook from exhaustion. Snow settled on his coat, melting against the heat still radiating from his body. He turned toward the remaining medics, making sure all survivors had been counted. The final number was confirmed. 40 men evacuated. More than twice what procedure had predicted possible. Elias stepped back. His knees buckled briefly, but he caught himself. He looked at the destroyed farmhouse one last time. Flames flickered along the broken chimney stump. The hoist system, improvised from barn rope and a broken wagon pulley, had done what every regulation said it could not. The lieutenant finally spoke. He said that command would be informed of the outcome. Elias nodded once. He made no comment. Snow continued to fall, covering the ruins like a thin white shroud. The battle moved on. The burning farmhouse collapsed into embers behind the American lines as dawn settled across the Belgian fields. Snow continued to fall in slow drifting flakes, softening the jagged edges of shattered stone and twisted beams. Medics worked tirelessly to stabilize the 40 rescued men, wrapping them in blankets and loading them onto improvised sleds pulled toward the stalled ambulances behind the broken bridge. Elias stood at the edge of the courtyard, boots planted in frozen mud, his breath rising in steady clouds. His arms shook from the strain of hours at the crank. His gloves, burned through at the palms, hung in tatters. He flexed his fingers, numb from cold and effort. Snow gathered on his sleeves. The ache in his shoulders pulsed with every heartbeat. The lieutenant approached him again, slower this time. His voice carried a tone Elias had not heard before. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. He said nothing about regulations. Nothing about the ban. He only stated that every man rescued owed his life to the improvised hoist. Elias did not respond. He watched stretcher teams move across the field. He listened to the distant thump of artillery echoing through the Ardennes. The war pushed on. The front shifted. His thoughts drifted back to Oklahoma, where grain sacks once rose through dusty shafts on pulleys not so different from the one now melted in the ruins behind him. As the day advanced, engineers arrived to assess the damage. They listened carefully when medics and infantrymen described the extraction system. They examined the surviving rope fragments and the scorched stone around the collapsed chimney. One engineer took notes on the pulley's design and the counterweight arrangement. Another traced the hoist path through the burned shaft, measuring angles with a small steel gauge. They spoke quietly among themselves, recognizing the ingenuity required to evacuate 40 casualties under direct fire and spreading flames. They requested Elias to walk them through each stage. He did so with simple explanations. Rope tension, friction points, counterweight balance, shaft clearance, brick pinch zones. He spoke like a mill hand teaching a basic mechanics lesson. The engineers recorded everything. No report carried Elias's name. The official paperwork filed weeks later used neutral phrasing. It described a field-expedient vertical casualty extraction method. It mentioned notable success under duress. It noted potential for adaptation in mountain rescue or subterranean evacuations. No authors signed the report. It remained a technical note, filed deep within divisional archives where few would ever read it. The men saved by the hoist remembered him differently. Some carried burns. Some carried scars. Some carried the memory of rising through smoke while a rope groaned under their weight and a determined sergeant turned a crank below. They nodded at him during the long march deeper into Belgium. Some saluted him despite lacking rank to do it. Elias returned each gesture with the faintest incline of his head. He never spoke of the ban. No one else did either. In the months that followed, the division pushed east through fire-swept towns, frozen forests and river crossings lit by muzzle flashes. The war dragged through mud and exhaustion. Elias continued serving with quiet focus. He performed his duties with the same steady discipline he brought to the mill back home. He fixed broken equipment. He repaired jammed rifle actions. He helped medics reposition the wounded under mortar fire. He never tried to repeat the chimney hoist. The opportunity never came again. When the war ended, the 30th Infantry Division stood among ruins scattered across Germany. Smoke drifted from collapsed buildings. Roads lay choked with debris. Elias stood in the aftermath, watching columns of displaced civilians move past the division checkpoints. Victory came without celebration. It came with silence, with relief tempered by the weight of memory. Elias kept to himself during those final months, doing his part and remaining unnoticed. He returned to Oklahoma in late 1945. The mill had not changed. The same wooden beams stretched across the ceiling. The same dust-covered pulley wheels turned above the grain conveyor. His uncle welcomed him back with a handshake and a quiet nod. Elias resumed work within days. He tightened bearings. He cut replacement rope lengths. He greased crank gears. He lifted sacks of grain the same way he had before the war. Sometimes, when the mill was empty and the machines clattered in a steady rhythm, he paused to listen to the creak of rope under tension. The sound carried him back to the burning farmhouse in Belgium. Back to the chimney glowing from heat. Back to the stretcher ropes trembling under weight. Back to the moment each hoist cleared the top and another wounded man tasted cold morning air instead of smoke. He never considered himself a hero. He believed he had simply done what needed to be done. The men he saved remembered otherwise, but their stories faded over the years. Most returned home to quiet lives. Some spoke of the rescue only to family. Others never mentioned it at all. The war was over. People wanted to forget. Elias lived simply. He worked at the mill. He ate supper with his uncle. He walked the dirt road to town on Sundays. He repaired pulley systems wherever he found them. He preferred silence to praise. He preferred broken machinery to broken conversation. Yet, on rare days, when a rope creaked under a heavy load and the pulley wheel spun with steady resistance, he allowed himself one small thought. He knew what a rope and a crank could save. He knew what a chimney could become. And he knew that in the darkest hours of a winter battlefield, when orders failed and structures burned and lives hung on the edge of collapse, a simple lift built from barn rope and stubborn will had carried 40 men upward into survival. That knowledge was enough.